Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And part 3 in my seemingly infinite part series on Fatal, the game that just keeps going. In part 1, we looked at some incredibly offensive things while defining our character's abilities, race, and gender. Then in part 2, we looked at some incredibly boring, yet still offensive things while rolling up a mind-numbing amount of pointless minutiae. And in this part, hey, you know what? Maybe instead of getting back into Fatal, we could make a Metamorphosis Alpha character. That sounds fun, right? No? You want to finish the Fatal character? Fine. In this part, we will be generating our character's sociality, occupation, and skills, the final pieces in this jigsaw puzzle of a garbage dump that is a Fatal character. And just a little bit of a spoiler here, this is where everything really starts to fall apart. Yeah, relatively speaking, it was coherent up until this point. So let's finish making us a Fatal character. Part 3. A game not designed to be played. When last we left our character, we were in Chapter 6, Sociality, and we still are. So the first thing here is name, which requires a detour to Appendix 7, Names. And this is possibly the most pathetically designed section in the entire book. So, human and Anakim names are English, bugbear names are Icelandic, dwarven names are German, elven names are Old English Anglo-Saxon, and okay, maybe some of those make kinda thematic sense, but then kobold names are Indonesian. Because of a similarity in height? Because apparently, the exclusion of non-European influences, a very non-racist core tenet of this game's philosophy, is the sort of thing that they are only willing to violate for the purpose of being racist. And then the subterranean troll names are classical Greek, excluding the names of prominent ancient Greek philosophers who the author likes to pretend would have considered him a peer, and therefore does not want to associate with the dirty trolls. And also notable is the fact that aside from humans, none of the other races have last names. Bugbears basically have 2 first names, so I'm not counting it. Because that would require additional tables, which I would think that he would like, but also possibly coming up with ideas, a thing that he really doesn't seem to like. I joked about this before, but the man seems to have basically no capacity for actual creativity. The only way he could conceive of to populate lists of names for fantasy races was just to pick out random cultures and then copy lists of names from those cultures. And yeah, making up hundreds of names would be very difficult and time-consuming, but in a perfect example of the limits of the author's abilities, there are only 96 male dwarven names, and then reroll for 97 to 100. He literally could not make up 4 names, or at least just pull up a second reference for medieval German names. And yeah, there is something of an established fantasy trope of associating elves and dwarves with various human cultures, but there is no kind of precedent, historically, mythologically, or found in traditional fantasy, for subterranean trolls to be Greek, or kobolds to be Indonesian. The only possible explanation is that he literally did it entirely to make fun of an Indonesian person, which is 100% a possibility when you are dealing with this game. Now, to be fair, he did make all of these ogre and troll nickname tables. Just look at the creativity on display here. Okay, Ass Slasher is a pretty cool name, but other than that, it's mostly just edgy try-hard nonsense. And also note that all of the ogre tables are specified as male, but it is of course unclear if females just don't have nicknames, he forgot to make them, or was going to make them but then decided it was too much work and then just kind of forgot to remove the male label because the existence of female characters that the author does not want to bang is something rarely considered in this game. But hey, this video is just started and there will be plenty of time to make fun of the author, who definitely did not leave a comment on the last video about his weed-smoking girlfriends. So let's just pull up the female kobold name table, which is a D1000 table. So we roll, and 627, which is Parmy. And I think this might be the only game I've seen where even your name is assumed to be rolled by default. Then back to Chapter 6 to roll our character's birthday, which is 1d20 for the month, re-rolling if over 13 because they use a 13-month calendar, then 1d12 plus 1d20 minus 1 for the date, and let's address a couple things here. First, yes, that gives a range of 1 to 31, just not an evenly distributed range of 1 to 31. And this is of course not a time when you want a curvy result because, last I checked, people are not statistically more likely to be born in the middle of the month. And second, if we look at the Noveria book, one of the few things that it actually does cover is the fact that in this world, a year is 364 days split into 13 months of 4 7-day weeks. So within the lore of the game world, dates should max out at 28, which makes this hilariously not accurate for the real world, but then even less accurate for the fantasy world in which the game is set. And remember, you have to re-roll results over 13 for the month, so they are not against re-rolling, so why not just do the same with the date on a D30 or a D40 depending on whether they want to adhere to a 31 or 28 day month? I mean, surely the smartest, most innovative game designer ever knows that you can roll a D30 or a D40. Yeah, I'm just kidding. I'm sure he has never considered the possibility of anything more advanced than adding extra zeros to a percentile roll. Like, I'm pretty sure that D1 million you have to roll is only there because he realized it was a thing that you could do and was trying to flex. Anyway, then year is just equal to 5100 minus our age, and that is conveniently by the kobold calendar, not human for some reason, because apparently the intention was to have different calendars for the different cultures, which is just so on brand for this game. So our birthday is 4th month. Months are specifically stated to not have names, which, in addition to being super historically accurate, I'm sure has nothing to do with the author being unable to come up with one, much less 13 month names. But getting back to our character's birthday, 4th month, 26th, 5083. And that was just a whole thing that was necessary for some reason. Then our birth status, and we are too legit to quit. And then social class, which is where things are going to get fucky. There are 5 social classes a character can be: royalty, nobility, serf, peasant, and slave. And a table for each race, excluding Anakim, who share a table with humans, as well as base and Kinderfresser ogres, and Borbitingarna and hill trolls, who have no society to speak of, and therefore no social class. Except that there is a table for the base and Kinderfresser ogres, like one that even has a note specifically mentioning the Kinderfressers. But let's just ignore that little inconsistency for now. I'm sure it's a thing that won't come up again, and roll on the kobold table. And we rolled a 12, which is slave, which gives us 1d4 silver points and means we are illiterate. And that might seem like some bad luck on our part, if not for the fact that there is a 60% chance of rolling slave on the kobold table, and for humans, it's 30%. So historically/mythologically accurate McGee here seems to think that 30%, nearly 1/3 of the medieval European population, were slaves, which I'm sure is totally not part of some weird power fantasy. But regardless, we must keep going, so let's roll our birthplace, which is Hamlet, then siblings, and 79 plus 5 for being a kobold is 84, and 1d4 brothers and 1d4 sisters, so 2 and 3. Then birth rank, which is rolled with a die with a number of sides equal to or more than the number of siblings plus ourselves, so a d6, and we are rank 2 of 6. And then marital status, we do not have to roll because kobolds do not recognize matrimony, which probably means we shouldn't have had to roll for birth status, like it is implied ogres and trolls don't have to, and that is the second such inconsistency in 4 pages. Also, apparently gay characters can be married, just not happily. And that is yet another thing where you genuinely have to ask yourself if it's just a mistake or the author trying to make some asinine point, as both are equally valid explanations. But now we move on to Chapter 7, Occupation, where we have D1000 occupation tables for peasants, serfs, nobility, and royalty. And notably, these are for family occupation, which is a weird distinction to make because there's nothing anywhere about selecting an occupation outside of your family occupation, and it seems like just another one of those things that the author thought was really big brain, but only makes things more confusing. And we do actually have some special rules for being a slave, but first, I would like to bring up the ogres and trolls again. There are 4 types of ogre and 3 types of troll. And one type of troll has like full-on societies with ancient Greek names and everything, so they're not really relevant right here. But of the remaining 6, we are told that 4, base and Kinderfresser ogres and Borby-Tingarna and hill trolls, do not have any kind of society, and therefore no social class. But then we do have a social class table labeled for all of the ogres, including the ones who are not supposed to have a social class, and specifically mentioning one of them. But then all 6 of these races have one of 2 lists for rolling occupations in their race entry, including the ones who are supposed to have societies and social classes and therefore presumably roll on these social class tables. So obviously the Borby-Tingarna and hill trolls use those lists in their race entries because they're the only options available. But then the process of determining the occupation of an ogre is weirdly unclear, as each type of ogre has 2 different occupation lists. And I'm sure you're thinking that this is the last time this is going to come up, and no, of course not. And these are really the sorts of major inconsistencies that you normally see in a hastily thrown together project being worked on separately by multiple people with little to no oversight or time for editing. Not one person's magnum opus that they've sunk years of their life and their entire identity into. But fortunately for us, we do not have to deal with trolls, ogres, or D1000 tables, because we just go straight to the slave occupation, which basically just requires that we roll a second occupation on a special table separated by gender that offers pretty much the options you would expect for female characters. And in a weird way is actually more convenient than for a non-slave character, but I will get to that in a bit. Also, it asks you to roll for your master's social class and occupation, of course re-rolling nonsensical results, which is weird because every result in this damn game is nonsensical. And let's just save time here by assuming that they are also a kobold, and Roll a few times, I guess peasant butcher is a sensical enough thing to move forward with. Maybe they got a really good deal because of our repelling face. So let's roll on the table, and 32, dancer. So let's pull up the dancer occupation and see that being a dancer requires physical fitness 90, bodily attractiveness 100, kinetic charisma 115, agility 115, and intelligence 80. Yeah, weirdly strict requirements to be a dancer. Also, male dancers are uncommon. Dancers may be of any race other than ogre, Borby-Tingarna, and hill troll, any disposition or temperament, have sociality of slave or serf, and be of any religion. They also get +5 to the dance skill, no equipment, magic points are inapplicable, and gain 10 advancement points for each new dance move learned. And I will discuss advancement in the next video, but for now, I will just say that that is the way you gain advancement points. You do not also gain them for things like defeating a goblin or solving a riddle. And don't worry, it gets even stupider from there. And unfortunately, we do not meet the bodily attractiveness or agility requirements, and this is where, if we had rolled a desirable occupation, we could take those sub-ability rerolls to hopefully meet the requirements. And then I guess would have to adjust all of the junk related to the sub-abilities. But once again, we will not, because as I mentioned in the first video, it is a very bad idea. So I guess we'll just reroll, and 3, which is Chambermaid. So let's pull up Chambermaid, and being a Chambermaid requires Common Sense 90, check. Female only, check. Any race other than ogre, Borby-Tingarna, and hill troll, check. Any disposition or temperament, check, check. Slave, peasant, or serf, check. Any religion, check. Okay, I guess we meet all the requirements. We can be a chambermaid. So being a chambermaid gives us +5 to the cleaning skill, equipment depending on duties, inapplicable magic points, and we gain 10 advancement points for each day of cleaning that pleases the master or mistress. And incidentally, slaves gain 1 additional point each day that they are not beaten, so actually advance slightly faster. And a chambermaid's duties include cleaning the house, assisting the mistress, and pleasuring the master and his sons. Because fucking goddamn fatal. Actually, the majority of the chambermaid entry deals with them being employed as prostitutes. Except that by rules as written, the way that I am positive fatal is intended to be interpreted, they don't actually gain any advancement points for doing so. Also, apparently by age 30, they are too old and either marry or become beggars, and if that seems harsh, well, then go check out the actual prostitute occupation, which tells you even more that you never wanted to know about the author's attitude towards women. But now, let's talk about some of those restrictions on the occupations. Notably, the disposition, temperament, and religion restrictions are almost never used. There are a handful of entries that offer suggestions for those things, and a handful of actual religion requirements, as well as 2 disposition requirements, 3 if you include Mountaineer not being able to have a disposition of Ogre. And keep in mind, this is like the 2nd edition of the game, and that is a mistake from at least the 2003 version. And of course, no actual temperament requirements, because as I said in the last video, the temperaments serve no actual purpose. So the vast majority of those entries just say any. And it has the very distinctive feeling of thinking that the more things that are listed in the entry, the more professional the game looks. So there's just all of this stuff taking up space. And things that are there just taking up space is a topic I will be discussing a little bit at the end of this video, but then mostly in the next video, so I will discuss it then. But now I really want to dig into how the 163 occupations are restricted by gender and race? Spoiler, the answer is comically. So first, male characters have unrestricted access to 89% of the occupations, while females only have 27%. And then for those listed as uncommon, it's 4% versus 6%. And then the big one here, male characters are considered rare in 2% of occupations, and female characters are rare in 61% of occupations. And yes, it does not say that rare means they cannot be that occupation, because it doesn't really elaborate on anything, but you do get the impression that the implication here is that the E-dial is supposed to say no. And interestingly, male and female characters are only actually outright blocked from 8 and 9 occupations respectively, although which occupations specifically makes it a little less even. As in general, I'm assuming that nobody is going to consider not being able to play as a chambermaid, delouser, or laundress to be an impediment to their enjoyment of the game. And now let's look at the restrictions by race. As you can see, most of the races have an acceptable chunk of occupations not available to them. For example, humans and bugbears are the only seafaring races, and therefore the only ones who qualify for sailing-related occupations. And then, of course, there are the ogres and trolls, who only have access to a handful of occupations, and you might be assuming that it's those ones specifically listed in their race entry, but also, if you've been paying attention, you likely realize that I only phrase something like that when it is not. So the figures that I'm working on here come from the restrictions listed in the occupations themselves, according to which ogres, Borby-Tingarna, and hill trolls do not qualify for some of those occupations listed in their race entry. Which should surprise nobody, as I've already brought up the inconsistencies with the occupations for those races several times. And it kinda has this feeling like the author didn't really want the ogres and trolls to be there, couldn't even be bothered to write content for them beyond they eat people. Like, any but ogre, Borby-Tingarna, and hill troll is the default entry for race restrictions. Like, that is the restriction listed on 105 of the occupations. But as I said way back in the first video, the author does not seem to be aware of the fact that he can, instead of barring ogres and trolls from 96% of the occupations, just remove them from the game. And it really feels, especially here, like the goal is just to put in as many things as possible without ever considering if any of those things work together or benefit the game in any way. And remember how I said that being a slave was in a way more convenient? Well, just imagine how many times you would have to roll on a D1000 table to actually get an occupation that even our non-ogre character is not disqualified for based on race, gender, or abilities. Actually, you don't have to imagine, because I rolled on the surf table until I got one, and it took 10 rolls to get pickpocket. Which coincidentally happens to display evidence that at one time there was some kind of a grouped class system here, like in D&D 2nd edition or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st and 4th editions. Seriously, when you read through this book, you just keep stumbling on these little things that are like half-baked, unimplemented ideas or random concepts from previous versions of the game that the author was too lazy to remove, and it just makes the whole thing feel even weirder and more inconsistent. And for those who may be interested, based on that and other similar text, here is what may have been the original classes from Fatal when it at least resembled a playable game. Like, in the first video, when I said it was unfortunate that the earliest versions of Fatal were likely lost to time, I was serious. I would really like to have a fuller development history of this game, because there are hints that at one point, it was almost sane. But now let's get back to our character and move on to Chapter 8, Skills. And this part is completely unhinged. We get a number of skill points based on our race and age category, and you might notice that the values here are really low, especially considering that there are over 160 skills. And that is because what we do here, in another strong contender for most absurd thing in this game, is roll skill points for each year of our character's life based on the age category at the time. So we get 1d8 minus 1 points for each of the 3 years of infancy and 5 of childhood, 1d6 minus 1 for each of the 5 years of puberty, and 1d10 divided by 2 minus 1 for each of the 4 years of being a young adult. And I am assuming this is for years elapsed, so that is why I am counting age 0 but not age 17. And then, of course, we do not add these together. Instead, we must spend them year by year, which of course also means that they can only be spent on skills reasonable for the current age. Also, it is stated that kobolds begin working at age 6, and that is important here because for every year that we are working in our occupation, 1d100% of our skill points must be invested in career skills, which, reminder, we have one of, and it's cleaning. And for our first year of life, let's put points into sight, smell, sound, and sprint, which is the general locomotion skill and also covers crawling. Also for smell and sound, as well as taste and touch, we have to roll 3d10 to determine a base value, and then can only add up to another 1d10 additional points. And this is a thing only mentioned in those skill entries, and not like, at any point during the general character creation, despite being a thing that every character needs to do. And then the rest of our year's worth of points and whatever, keeping in mind that most, if not all of our points from age 6 onward are required to be put into cleaning. Then we also get +5 in cleaning from our occupation, and +3 in direction sense, mining, and trickery from being a kobold, as well as training in one specific weapon, and that's a whole other thing for the next video, but for now let's just say dagger. And that is it for skills, and yeah, really inconvenient, but consider that elves and dwarves are not just possibly, but likely going to start the game with an age in the hundreds. And the book does take that into consideration, stating that if a character is over 30, the player may bargain with the Aedile to be allowed to invest the points in a lump sum, which, in addition to just glossing over the problem, also encourages this game's weird, almost fetishistic, uneven power dynamic between the players and Game Master. Also, hopefully you've realized, but the real big issue here is that determining skill points by age like this severely imbalances the game, since an average elf will have nearly 1,000 skill points, and our fairly average kobold has 45. And that is the sort of oversight that should have been impossible to miss. Like, how do you just kind of forget to take into account the fact that your game has elves? But with that nonsense out of the way, we can now move on to Chapter 9, Equipment. And we have 1 silver, so we can't buy shit, but have presumably been provided clothes from our occupation. I realize that considering the game we're talking about here, that is not a given, but I don't care. And clothing provides 1 point of armor versus brawling damage, none versus hacking, pounding, or stabbing, and of course this only applies to parts of the body that are covered by the clothing. It also gives a -1 penalty to the silent skill and has 2 integrity points, which are like hit points but for items. And reduces brawling damage by 10%, hacking and pounding damage by 5%, increases burning damage by 5%, reduces freezing damage by 20%, and electrocuting damage by 5%. And as you can probably guess, all of that stuff is going to make combat very interesting. But that is all stuff to talk about more when we discuss combat in the next video. So now, finally, after 3 videos, over 100 minutes of content, 327 rolls with 654 dice, and countless hours of lost precious time that I will never get back, this character is done. And normally this is where I would talk about mechanics and advancement, but no, as I've already established, that is in the next video. But now I have some thoughts, as I always do. Presumably the sassy commentary and analysis is part of the reason why you watch these videos. You may recall from way back in part 1, I said that there was a perspective that the author refused to consider. And that is the perspective that this is a game. The entire thing seems to have been made without ever really considering the possibility of it being a thing that people would actually play. Like, everything superficially resembles a game. There are game mechanics, there are player options, there are character creation rules, but as I've said before, there was never any consideration for the practicality of any of it. Like, as I pointed out in the last 2 parts, every race other than human is basically unplayable in the game world. And they did not have to be. It's just that as they poured more and more edge into the game, at no point did they stop and ask, can an elf, human, and dwarf go on an adventure together? Because in almost every other medieval fantasy game, that is not only a possibility, but an expected thing. But here in Fatal, it's not. The idea of a group of characters going on an adventure was barely, if ever, a consideration when determining what content would be included and how that content would be defined. Like I said way back at the beginning of this mess, being the most difficult, detailed, realistic, and historically/mythologically accurate role-playing game was the only goal here. And you can actually see some of the misguided intention behind these weird decisions. For example, the profusion of occupations, most of which are completely useless within the context of a fantasy adventure role-playing game, obviously came from the idea of it being unrealistic that every character would be a trained fighter, magic user, and/or scholar in a world where, statistically speaking, most people would be laborers and craftsmen. And that's an idea that has reasoning behind it. But it's stupid reasoning, and anyone who's ever, actually played a role-playing game would immediately realize that a group of characters consisting of a 12-year-old dairymaid, elderly dwarven cooper, bugbear navigator, and Borbitine Garna gladiator would not work. That the lack of realism in other games is necessary to make them games. And that having characters who are actually capable of doing the tasks they are doing is far more historically/mythologically accurate than just taking a random sampling of the entire population. Because that is actually the big distinctive feature of Fatal. It provides a world and then a series of tables based on the statistical makeup of that world. So when you make a character, it is just a random inhabitant of that world. And that is the intention behind the design of the character creation. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And in the abstract, isolated mechanics of Fatal, that makes sense. Because the perspective from which the game was made is, this is a realistic and detailed depiction of a character from this world, not, this is a character you can play as in a game. The idea of gameplay is not in any way central to the game's design. It's all just, as I said, abstract isolated mechanics without any consideration for practical application. Oh, I guess it is scholarly after all. Just for comparison, any competently designed game starts with what are the player characters going to be doing, and then provides options for making characters who would be doing those things. For example, if you were playing a spy game, the options available would be for spies and other spy-adjacent characters. There would not be options for playing as a carpenter. But Fatal, in its character creation, seems to be much more concerned with being a census of an edgy fantasy world than it is any kind of actual game. Also, Fatal has this reputation for being this obsessive work where every detail is overdone to a comical degree. But the deeper you get into it, the more clear it becomes that the author doesn't really care that much about the actual game. He seems to like coming up with ideas and considering himself a game designer, but whenever a part of the game doesn't tickle his murderfuck fantasy, he just doesn't really bother with it. Once you get past all the circumference rolling and maximum words spoken per minute, Fatal's actually kinda half-assed. For example, once you get to the sociality section, the author just kinda stops caring about ogres. Like, yeah, it was cool and fun and edgy to write in graphic detail about how the ogres hunt and eat people, especially children. That's extra edgy. But then when you actually have to start writing about their culture and society and making up names and incorporating them into an impractical social class and occupation system, that's boring, so he just did the bare minimum, or less. It's also incredibly clear which occupations he actually wanted to include and which ones he just kind of decided that he had to include for some reason. And another thing that's really hard to tell if it's a result of laziness, incompetence, or intentionally trying to make the entries look bigger than they are, the guild entry, when actually used, is filled with one of several blocks of nearly identical text. And reusing text like this is a thing he does a lot and speaks to something of a greater problem, but that is a problem I will discuss in the next video. But it is another really common thing that you see in these first-time game designers who have decided that they are going to revolutionize the entire tabletop gaming hobby. They actually put effort only into the things that they think are their big revolutionary ideas, but then either just don't do or half-ass everything else. And that is a thing we will be seeing a lot more of in the next video, where we take all of these numbers we generated for some reason and try to make them actually do something. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Randy Mulholland, and Toshirokuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos floating around screen that either myself or the cold, heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.